You're all still here. My boring voice hasn't chased you away yet. Well, thanks for coming on a date with dinosaurs and fossils. As I look around you, I feel like the dinosaur tonight. And Ruan, you're the fossil? Or anybody else want to volunteer to be the fossil? No, we're going to look for a date for dinosaurs and fossils. A fascinating subject. Who isn't interested in dinos? When are we told that they went extinct? Listen on National Geographic or reading the newspapers. When are we told all the time that dinosaurs went extinct? Come on. Millions. How many? A lot? A lot of millions? Anybody know their dinos? Huh? 65. You listen up. You'll often hear that dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, the end of the Mesozoic era. So we're told that dinosaurs are 65 million years old. We're going to try and find an answer on that question tonight. And I want to remind you again, there's two types of science: experimental, observational, repeatable, testable science. But when it comes to telling a story about the past, looking at the evidence of dinosaur fossils, or any fossils, and trying to tell a story about the processes and the time periods, it's a different type of science, historical or forensic science. I'm sure many of you followed the Oscar Pistorius trial last year. What did we see there? We saw forensic experts for the prosecution and for the defense. They had both seen the same forensic evidence, the same bullet holes, the same blood spatter, the movement, the position of bedding and all of these sorts of things. And they both told a different story. They both had a different interpretation of what had happened just a few days previously to them being there. Why is that? Well, because the past is not experimentally testable, provable, like we can do with operational science. By the way, I hope some of you have the ambition to be scientists. Don't be afraid of science. There are many, many creation, Bible-believing scientists out there in the universities. There's a geologist up in Johannesburg. My colleague was a zoologist at the University of Wits University, I think, Witwatersrand. University of Stellenbosch, nuclear physicist that believes the Bible is true, and we can believe it from the very first verse. So when we're dealing with the past, it's a different kind of science, and of course it therefore applies to dinosaurs. And if you don't believe me, here's a famous evolutionist, one of the most influential evolutionists of the last century, Ernst Mayr. And he said, what I've basically just told you, he said evolutionary biology, in contrast to physics and chemistry, is a historical science. The evolutionist attempts to explain events and processes that have already taken place. So he agrees with me that there's this type of science, historical science, dealing with the past. And as an evolutionist, he interprets the past through that worldview that we talked about earlier: death, suffering, bloodshed, disease, over billions of years leading to the existence of man. It's a belief system that doesn't come from science, it comes from philosophy, a rejection of the authority of God's word. And so when anybody digs up a fossil, whether something like this ammonite or a dinosaur bone, it doesn't come with a label attached that says 65 million years old. We all observe the same facts. It doesn't matter whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist. We've all got the same facts. Where we differ is how we interpret those facts. By the way, if I dig up a fossil like this, and I'm looking at this fossil, this ammonite, it's been nicely polished up for tourists, and am I dealing with something in the past or the present? Hands up if you say the past. Hands up if you say the present. Hands up if you're sitting on the fence. Most of you, there we go. Okay, we're dealing with the present. We can measure it, we can look at it, we can see what it weighs, we can see what kind of creature it is, examine what type of minerals make up that fossil. We're dealing with the present. When we tell a story about its origin and how it formed, we're dealing with the past. And so these type of constructs have been constructed through that evolutionary worldview, a philosophical, naturalistic or materialistic worldview that places these so-called simple creatures hundreds of millions of years ago, the so-called dinosaur era, then mammals. Do you know that that's just a total construct? There are many, obviously different types of creatures during the flood would have been buried in different places because they live in different environments. But many mammals have been found in the same layers as the dinosaurs. And so there's many anomalies to that picture that is presented, that geologic time scale. And the problem with that time scale is all of these things are meant to have died millions and millions of years before man ever came on the scene. And that puts death, millions of years of death and suffering and bloodshed and carnivory before Adam's sin. And so it's a major problem with trying to fit evolution into the Bible. So we're going to look at dinosaurs through that biblical framework that we spoke about earlier, the 7 C's of creation. So if we look at dinosaurs, dinosaurs were land-living, air-breathing animals. We sometimes call creatures like plesiosaurs and that also, we call them dinosaurs, but they were really marine reptiles. And some of those massive birds sometimes are referred to as flying dinosaurs, but they were actually flying reptiles as well. So dinosaurs, Tyrannosaurus rex, all of these creatures that lived on the land were land-living, air-breathing creatures. When, according to the Bible, would they have been created by God? When did God create the land-living, air-breathing animals? Day 6, exactly right. The same day as He created the first man and the first woman. So you might say, well, you mean that God created some of those things like Tyrannosaurus rex, those meat-eaters, carnivores, on day 6? Well, we're going to look at that question. But I want to ask you this tonight. Perception plays a big role in some of these things. But what type of creature is that? Is it a carnivore or a herbivore? Okay, look at its teeth. And sharp teeth. They look like they're there for ripping flesh. And you know that that's a fruit bat. Never eats any meat, only eats fruit. And there's many other creatures in the world today as well. Things like bears. If we look at their teeth, they seem to have carnivorous teeth. But bears mainly eat fruit and plants and so on. They're omnivores. And so that gives us a clue that, well, maybe all of these creatures that are today carnivorous, that's maybe not the way that God originally created them. And we're going to speak a bit more about that. Well, what about the dinosaur fossils? Doesn't fossilization tell us that dinosaurs are millions of years old? Well, let's look at fossils through an evolutionist's glasses, through an evolutionist worldview, and how fossils are formed. So here's an evolutionary biological textbook. It's an Australian textbook, I think. And here we find a fish swimming along in the ocean. It dies, sinks to the bottom. You can see the river in the background there, carrying silt down to the ocean. That covers up the fossil. Another fish dies, and that process repeats itself over and over again. Look at the story that's being told there. High mountains, there they're eroded away, and there they're almost completely gone. The story that's being told is that the process of fossilization is a very slow, gradual process over long periods of time. Any of you gone snorkeling, scuba diving? Ever seen hundreds of fish lying dead on the bottom of the ocean waiting to be covered in mud and silt? It's just not how it happens. So what do we need for fossilization to occur? Well, we need a healthy living organism to start with. A fish, a dinosaur, a mammal, or a bird, or whatever. We need that creature to be suddenly catastrophically trapped in a cement, a mortar of mud, minerals, to exclude predators, to exclude bacteria and oxygen, and allow enough time for fossilization to occur. Because what happens to a creature when it dies today? It bloats, it floats, scavengers eat it, and in a short space of time, there's nothing left of it. So it's a totally different process that is needed for fossilization to occur. Let's think of the 7 C's. Which one of those seas gives us a good understanding of why we find billions of dead things buried in rock layers that have been laid down by water all over the earth? Which sea? The third sea, the catastrophic flood of Noah's time, which tells us that the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were open, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Very often we think of the flood of Noah's time as being this torrential, global downpour of rain for 40 days and 40 nights. It was that, but it was far more than that. The fountains of the deep broke up. Volcanism, earthquakes, tsunamis, the release of underground ash, steam, mud, minerals. We're also providing a perfect environment to explain why we find these billions of dead things in fossil fields in the Karoo and the West Coast and on every continent. These vast fossils of millions or fields of millions and millions of fossils. Processes that are not taking place today. An amazing, catastrophic flood event that the Bible gives us an understanding of why we find those fossils. Well, what about radioisotope dating? Somebody asked me earlier about radioisotope dating. Do you know that there is not an instrument that measures age? You cannot measure age. I can't stick a needle into one of you and it'll tell me your age. And the same thing with rocks and fossils and so on. You cannot directly measure the age of something. You can measure processes going on in an object. You can measure the minerals and the elements inside an object. And then using assumptions about the past, you can construct an age. There are many dating systems. There's many processes going on in the world today that indicate that the world is only a few thousand years old. Radioisotope dating is used to prove that the Earth is billions of years old. All of these dating methods operate on a set of assumptions that I'm going to show you here. Let's test your maths. Let's see which school has got the best maths. We've got lots of competition going on tonight. Let's say you walk into a bathroom and you immediately see that there's 100 liters of water in the bathtub and the tap is running at 10 liters per minute. How long has that process been going on for? Okay, you're all boffins, right? Your maths is correct. Whew. Your parents are spending their school fees wisely. Not wasting their school fees. Okay, but let's ask ourselves some questions. Was the bathtub half empty or half full when that process started? Was water removed or added? Did the flow rate increase or decrease, or was it even turned off? Fortunately, Eskom's not running our water services, so generally the water services don't get turned off. But you see, you were not there in the past. You walked in and you saw the quantity and the process in the present. And it's exactly the same with all of these so-called dating methods. These processes going on. Those that indicate a young Earth are subject to those same assumptions about the past, untestable assumptions about the past, and the same with radioisotope dating and these various other dating methods. They all work on that same set of assumptions about the past, and we cannot go back and test the past. We can't test the rate at which radioisotope decay takes place. We cannot test how much of the starting quantities of these elements, the parent elements and daughter elements in radioisotope decay, and so on. But what can we do in the present to see whether radioisotope dating is accurate or not? Well, what if we could find rock of known age and send it off to a radioisotope dating laboratory and see what type of results we get? Well, over the last 20 years, it's been done many, many times. Potassium argon. Argon is a gas, and when a rock comes out of the ground as lava or magma, any gas that is in there should boil away. And then the potassium decays over time into argon. And potassium argon radioisotope dating is a very common method used for dating rocks and things. Well, this dome, this lava dome, erupted in 1986 in Washington State in Western America. And 10 years after it erupted, some scientists went and took samples from there, being very careful to avoid contamination. They sent those samples off to a radioisotope dating laboratory, a normal secular dating laboratory, and look at the results that they got for rocks that were 10 years old at the time. 350,000 to 2.8 million years old for rocks that were known to be 10 years old at the time. This has been done many times. A volcano in Hawaii known to have erupted 200 years ago, and that gave results of 160 million to 3.3 billion years old. And so the point is, if we cannot trust these dating methods for rocks of known age, how can we possibly trust them for rocks of unknown age? Carbon-14, when we think of radioisotopes and dating methods, we often think of carbon-14. Now, carbon-14 is an unstable element, an unstable isotope of carbon. Normal carbon is carbon-12, and carbon-14 is unstable. It decays to nitrogen-14. And it's got a half-life, a theoretical half-life of 5,730 years. So it decays quite rapidly. We've, all of us, got a little bit of carbon-14 in our bodies. I think it's like 1 part in 1.2 trillion parts of carbon-12. We've got a little bit of radioactive carbon-14 in our bodies, all living things, so we're all a little bit radioactive. Now, it decays very quickly. So a maximum time period of 50,000 to 100,000 years, there should be absolutely no carbon-14 left in any object. A bone, a fossil, petrified wood, whatever, diamonds, coal. After a maximum of 50,000 to 100,000 years, no detectable carbon-14 left. Now, what did we say about dinosaurs? We're told they went extinct 65 million years ago. If somebody is an evolutionist, believes that the dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, would they think of looking for carbon-14 in dinosaur bones? No. Theoretically, after a maximum of 100,000 years, should be no carbon-14 left. Well, just a couple of years ago, some European scientists took a number of dinosaur bone samples and they subjected them to radio-14 using mass spectrometers, and all of them, they found carbon-14 in those bones. And they yielded results for those bones, ages for those bones of between 20,000 and 40,000 years old. Now, that's based on the same assumptions about the past, and so that's also inaccurate. We believe that most of the dinosaur fossils we find are the remains of the dinosaurs that died about 4,500 years ago during the flood of Noah. But you see how one dating method totally contradicts the other radioisotope dating methods. The difference between 65 million years and 20 to 40,000, two different dating methods. Which do we believe? Well, we cannot believe either, but we can take God's word as truth. And that was presented at a geophysics conference in Singapore, I think in 2012. Lots of other evidence indicating that dinosaurs lived relatively recently. Dr. Mary Schweitzer, she's an American paleontologist, and she studies dinosaur bones. And she was looking at Tyrannosaurus rex, pieces of Tyrannosaurus rex bones under an electron microscope. And she began to see what seemed to be soft tissue, blood vessels, sinews. Over time, she's discovered red blood cells, even fragments of DNA that were flexible and resilient, and when stretched, returned to its original shape. Red blood cells. And she said it was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. But of course I couldn't believe it. I said, why couldn't she believe it? Because she believes in evolution. And she believed they died out 65 million years ago. And she, as a scientist, she knows that when a creature dies, the vibration, molecular vibration that takes place, biological material decays, it falls apart. very, very quickly. But as a good scientist, she did her observations again and again. As the fossil dissolved, transparent vessels were left behind. It was totally shocking, Schweitzer said. I didn't believe it until we'd done it 17 times. She then began to try and publish her work. And for a long time, none of your secular magazines, scientific journals, would publish her research. But she did very, very good research. And she said she had one reviewer tell me that he didn't care what the data said. He knew that what I was finding wasn't possible. I wrote back and said, well, what data would convince you? And he said, none. Why is that? Because it contradicted his worldview. That worldview of death, suffering, bloodshed over millions of years. And so he refused to accept her evidence. Well, she's been published many times now. She's a good scientist. She did very good research. She still believes in millions of years. So she's now involved in research to try and find out how this soft tissue, this biological material, could have survived 65 million years without being fossilized. And as I say, they've even found fragments of DNA which fall apart, decay extremely quickly. So why do people struggle to believe the evidence of their own eyes? Do you know that the Apostle Peter 2,000 years ago said that in the last days, scoffers would come and they would deny two things. Firstly, that by the word of God, the heavens were evolved. People would come that would deny that God created the heavens and the earth. The second thing that they would deny is that the world that then existed perished, being overflowed with water. They would deny the judgment flood of Noah's time. Why? Why are some scientists so unwilling to accept the evidence of their own eyes? Here's Thomas Nagel, an atheist professor at New York University. He said, I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Why? Any of you seen the movie on Stephen Hawking, Theory of Everything? Excellent movie, but he makes a statement in that movie that cosmology is a religion for atheists. Cosmology is a religion for atheists. It tells a story about how everything got here without God. Very interesting. Why? Well, if God made us, He sets the rules. He knows what's best for us. And many people are not willing to accept that authority over their lives. And I'm not saying that everybody believes in evolution is like this. You know, we all absorb things through our culture, through our education, through stuff in the media. We're absorbing things and we're forming a worldview based on those things that we are being fed. And increasingly we are being indoctrinated in evolution. And we need to begin to think about these things. Don't just absorb it. Don't take my word for what I'm telling you, but ask questions yourselves. Look for answers. Look at the resources that are out there. So how did dinosaurs become extinct? Well, evolutionists have got a number of theories. The most popular theory is that 65 million years ago there was this asteroid impact that catastrophically hit the Earth and wiped out all the dinosaurs. Well, how come some of them survived? Yeah? So-called living dinosaurs like crocodiles and so on. Why did they survive? And why did mammals and things survive if these asteroids wiped out all life? There's another theory, constipation, that don't laugh, this is a serious scientific theory here, that the dinosaurs weren't getting enough roughage in their diet, and that led to their extinction. So, eat your vegetables if you don't want to go the way of the dinosaurs. There's the junkie theory, that dinosaurs started to get addicted to narcotic plants, and that caused them to go extinct. Right? So, stay away from that stuff as well, right? You don't want to go the way of dinosaurs. Well, how did the dinosaurs go extinct then? Going back to the flood, we're told that every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping things and fowl of the heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only remained alive and they that were with him in the ark. So 2 of every kind of land-living, air-breathing animal and bird went onto the ark. Those alone survived. Everything else died. And 8 human beings, 4 men and 4 women, were the only ones that survived that terrible, terrible judgment flood of Noah's time. But that means that if 2 of every kind went onto the ark, there must have been dinosaur kinds that went onto the ark. So we find these fossil fields, these graveyards, dinosaur graveyards of thousands and thousands and thousands of dinosaur bones, and which would have happened during that year-long flood of Noah's time. But 2 of all flesh, wherein is the breath of life, came to Noah into the ark. So you mean dinosaurs went onto the ark? How's that possible? Well, first of all, we need to deal with what the ark looked like. I'm sure many of you have seen that kind of drawing. Maybe Mrs. Noah up on the deck hanging out the washing, a woodpecker pecking a hole in the ark that you see maybe in Sunday school. Well, the ark didn't look anything like that. The Bible tells us that it was 300 cubits long. A cubit was from the elbow to the fingertip, between 130 and 150 meters long, 50 cubits wide, probably close to 25 meters wide, 3 stories high, the Bible tells us, about 15 meters high. It was a massive, massive floating barge. For scale, you can see the size of 2 people there. Huge carrying capacity, more than enough space to carry 2 of every kind of land-living, air-breathing animal and bird, 2 of every kind of dinosaur, and the people, food, water, everything they needed for that year-long voyage. Well, what about all the water? Where did all the water come from that covered the earth? The Bible tells us that even the mountains were covered. Well, do you know that if we know that the earth is moving, and mountains are still being pushed up today, Mount Everest and so on, they're still getting higher. Well, if we were able to push down the mountains and raise the ocean trenches, the ocean valleys and so on, and make the world flat today, there would be enough water on earth today to cover the whole earth to a depth of 2.7 kilometers, 2,700 meters. Recently, more and more scientists are finding increasing evidence of huge subterranean reservoirs of water that they say may be up to 3 times the amount of water on the surface of the earth down under the mantle, in the so-called transition zone. So this earth is sopping wet. There's more than enough water to have covered the earth as it was before the flood. And Peter says that the earth that then existed perished. So what we see today isn't the way the earth was prior to the flood. Everything changed. Well, what about the dinosaurs? They were these massive creatures. Even on that huge big ark, how did they get these massive creatures onto their, like brachiosaurs and so on? Well, do you know that the average dinosaur, many dinosaurs were very small, the size of a chicken. The favorite takeout in those days was Kentucky Fried Dinosaur. But your average dinosaur was probably about the size of an eland. They weren't all these monstrous, huge, big creatures. Well, okay, so those could have easily come onto the ark, but what about the brachiosaurs and so on? How did they get them onto the ark? What type of creatures are dinosaurs? They are reptiles, reptilian. How are they born? Hatched from eggs. Do you know that the largest fossilized dinosaur eggs that have been found are just a little bit bigger than a rugby ball? So even your baby Brachiosaurus would probably have been about 1 meter high when it hatched. And then, so what would God have brought onto the ark? Junior or, going through their teenage years, dinosaurs, 2 of every kind, to enable them, once the flood was over, for them to begin to reproduce and populate the earth. And lots of research in our magazines dealing with these things. Well, how many species? You know, there's been hundreds of species of dinosaurs that have been identified. More and more evolution